Okay, here we go.
Surplus value.
Righty then. Sound eyes. All right, here we go.
Good.
The autonomouscollective.net, 20th of April. Welcome to a weekly Marx. We're doing, as in continuing on with Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 22, the Princeton edition with the two Pauls. This is the table for the text that compares the different editions, and more specifically, the second German edition, which is the basis for the current translation. And the fourth column is generally the English translation that a lot of things come from. And you can see that there's a difference in the chapter headings, as well as the coordination of content. So, chapter 22 in the edition, the current 2024 edition, is how surplus value turns into capital, um, which is essentially the equivalent of 24, the transformation of surplus value into capital. As you can see, last week we did 20 and 21, where the coordination is with chapter 21 and 23. So we're now on chapter 22, how surplus value is transformed into capital. The capitalist production process on an ever larger scale, the conversion of the proprietary laws of commodity production into the laws of capitalist appropriation. Earlier, we had to consider how surplus value arises from capital. Our task now is to examine how capital arises from surplus value. When surplus value is used as capital or transformed back into capital, the accumulation of capital occurs. Let's say a mass of capital amounts to 10,000 pounds and its variable component is 2,000 pounds. If the rate of surplus value is 100%, the capital will produce 2,000 pounds of surplus value in a certain amount of time, a year, for example. And if this 2,000 pounds is then advanced as capital, the original capital will increase from 10,000 pounds to 12,000 pounds. In other words, capital will accumulate. At first, however, it doesn't matter whether the additional capital is combined with the original capital or valorized independently of it. A sum of value of 2,000 pounds is a sum of value of 2,000 pounds. Money doesn't look or smell any different because it is surplus value. When value has the character of surplus value, we know how its owner came by it. But the fact that it is surplus value does nothing to alter the nature of value or money. The additional 2,000 pounds is transformed into capital in the same way as the original 10,000 pounds. The conditions of this metamorphosis don't change. One part of the 2,000 pounds must be turned into constant capital. The other part has to become variable capital. One part has to be turned into the objective factors of the labor process, namely the materials and the means of labor. The other part has to be turned into the subjective factor, namely labor power. The capitalist must therefore find these elements available in the labor market. This is how the process looks from the standpoint of the individual capitalist who turns a money sum of 10,000 pounds into commodities worth 12,000 pounds, reverse transforms the commodity value into 12,000 pounds in money, and then employs the original 10,000 pounds along with the additional 2,000 pounds as his capital. Now, but let's now view the original 10,000 pounds as social capital, or as capital belonging to all the members of the capitalist class, and the 2,000 pounds produced during the year as their surplus value. The surplus value is embodied in additional product or surplus product. Additional product or surplus product. Part of the surplus product is either reserved for the capitalist consumption fund or consumed by them as revenue. Aside from this part, and also international trade, which replaces domestic types of commodities with foreign ones, the natural form of the surplus product is made exclusively of means of production, that is, raw materials, auxiliary materials, means of labor, and necessary means of subsistence. In short, the material elements of constant and variable capital. So these elements don't wind up in the market as a matter of chance. Rather, they are pre-existing ways in which the newly produced surplus value exists. As for the additional labor needed, the bearers of labor power already employed can be put to work more extensively or intensively, or intensely, that is, more fully, at least up to a certain point. On the other hand, by supplying the thingly elements of the additional capital, the capitalist production process has already supplied additional bearers of labor power. Members of the working class come out of this process as they went into it, and thus at all different ages, their children, whose lives are secured by the average wage, have to constantly appear in the labor market alongside them. Viewed in concrete terms, accumulation is the capitalist process of reproduction on an ever-expanding scale. Surplus capital number one will be our name for the 2,000 pounds that is transformed into additional capital. For the sake of simplicity, we will assume that the ratio of its constant and variable components remains the same as does the rate of surplus value, that is 100%. We know how the 2,000 pounds of capital produces a surplus value of 400 pounds. This surplus value is then transformed back into capital. Thus, we get a surplus capital number two of 400 pounds and so on. What has changed? The 10,000 pounds that was originally transferred into capital belonged to an owner who put the money into the commodity and labor market. How did he come by it? We don't know. According to the law of commodity circulation, in an average transaction, equivalents are exchanged, and each commodity is exchanged only for another commodity. This encourages us to assume that the 10,000 pounds is the money form of the owner's own products and therefore his own labor, or it is the money form of labor performed by people for whom he functions as a legal representative. In contrast, we know exactly what process brought surplus capital number one into being. This capital is the transformed form of surplus value and thus surplus labor. In other words, another person's unpaid labor. Its owner doesn't pay an equivalent for even an atom of its value. Just as he did earlier with part of the original capital, the capitalist spends part of this surplus capital on labor power, from which he extracts surplus labor anew, thereby producing surplus value anew. Only now, having taken away the worker's own product or the value he has produced without giving him an equivalent, the capitalist uses that product or value to buy the worker, just as he puts the worker to work with means of production that are a product the worker is stripped of, whether in natura or in terms of their value, without getting an equivalent. It makes no difference at all whether the same individual workers who produce the surplus capital are also employed with it, or the unpaid labor of worker A, now transformed into money, is used to employ worker B. Such movement would affect only the appearance of things without making it any prettier. Because the relation of the individual capitalist and the individual worker is that of independent commodity owners, where one person buys labor power and the other sells it, the connection between them is accidental. The capitalist might turn the surplus capital into a machine that allows two children to replace the worker who produced that surplus capital and thus puts him out of work. All the components of surplus capital number one are produced by someone else's unpaid labor, that is, capitalized surplus value. The production process running its course for the first time, or the first act in capital's formation, disappears from view. It is as though the capitalist put some amount of value from his own fund into circulation. First, the invisible magic of the production process takes away the worker's surplus product, moving it from his side of the capital relation to the capitalist on the opposite side. Then the capitalist turns this wealth, for him something created from nothing, into capital, into a means to employ, rule over, and exploit additional labor power. The capitalist production process originally transforms only a money owner's sum of value into capital, and thus a source of surplus value. A change takes place in this sum of value, but the sum itself doesn't result from the capitalist production process. Instead, it is a precondition of that process that exists independently of it. In fact, we don't know how the capitalist came by the value in question and what his claim to it is. In the simple reproduction process, or the continuous production process, it is part of his own product that the worker keeps encountering anew as variable capital. But his product keeps taking on this form anew because he originally sold his labor power in exchange for the capitalist's money. Lastly, in the course of reproduction, all the capital value advanced becomes capitalized surplus value. This transformation presupposes, however, that the fund originally stemmed from the capitalist's own means. Not so in the accumulation process or the reproduction process on an ever larger scale. Whether the new capital takes the form of money or the things that make up the means of production and subsistence, its substance is the product of a process that extracts someone else's unpaid labor. Capital has produced capital. A sum of value that amounts to £10,000 and belongs to the capitalist is needed to create surplus value number one, surplus capital number one, £2,000. What is required to create surplus capital number two, £400, is nothing but the existence of surplus capital number one. Owning yesterday's unpaid labor now appears as the sole precondition for appropriating today's unpaid living labor on an ever larger scale. Insofar as the surplus value that makes up surplus capital number one arose when labor power was bought with part of the original capital, a transaction that conformed to the laws of commodity exchange and, legally speaking, presupposed nothing but that on the one side of the capital relation, the worker could do what he wanted with his skills, while on the other side, the money or commodity owner could do what he wanted with the value he owned. Furthermore, insofar as surplus capital number two is merely the result of surplus capital number one, and therefore a consequence of the relation described above. And finally, insofar as all transactions continue to conform to the laws of commodity exchange, which means that the capitalist continues to buy labor power and the worker continues to sell it at its actual value, we will assume. The law of appropriation of private property based on commodity production and circulation is obviously inverted into its direct opposite by its inexorable inner dialectic. The exchange of equivalents, which appeared here as the original operation, has been turned around in such a way that there is now only the semblance of exchange. How so? First, the part of capital exchange for labor power is merely part of the product of labor that, having been performed by other people, is then appropriated by the capitalist without an equivalent. And second, this part not only has to be replaced by the person who produced it, the worker, it has to be replaced with a new surplus. The relation of exchange between the capitalist and the worker becomes a mere semblance belonging to the circulation process, or merely a form that is alien to the content here and only mystifies it. The incessant buying and the incessant buying and selling of labor power is the form. The incessant buying and selling of labor power is the form. The content is that the capitalist keeps exchanging part of another's already objectified labor, which he always appropriates without an equivalent, thereby converting it into a larger quantity of someone else's living labor. Originally, the right to property presented itself to us as grounded in a person's own labor, or at least this assumption had to be made because commodity owners encounter each other only as equals before the law, and the only way to appropriate another person's commodity is to part with one's own, which can't be produced without labor. Ownership now appears on the capitalist side of the capital relation as the right to appropriate another person's unpaid labor, or the product of that labor, whereas on the worker's side, it appears as the impossibility of appropriating one's own product. The separation of property and labor becomes the necessary consequence of a law that seemed to proceed from the identity of those things. We saw that even in simple reproduction, all the capital advanced, however come by originally, is transformed into accumulated capital. In other words, capitalized surplus value. But in the flow of production, all the capital originally advanced becomes a vanishing magnitude, magnitude evanescence, in a mathematical sense, compared with the directly accumulated capital, or the surplus value or surplus product that is reverse transformed into capital. Moreover, this happens whether the capital originally advanced is functioning in the hands of the person who accumulated it or someone else's. Political economy thus portrays capital in general as accumulated wealth, that is, transformed surplus value or revenue, employed with a view to profit. And it represents the capitalists themselves as the possessors of surplus produce or capital. The same approach is merely expressed another way in the claim that all existing capital is accumulated or capitalized interest, since interest is nothing but a piece of surplus value. Section 2, Political Economy's Misunderstanding of Reproduction on an Ever Larger Scale. Before we attempt to develop a more precise account of accumulation, which arises when surplus value is reverse transformed into capital, we need to clear away some unclarity sown by political economists. When a capitalist uses his surplus value to buy commodities for his own consumption, they don't serve as his means of production or valorization any more than the labor he buys to satisfy his own natural or social wants and needs serves as productive labor. Here, the capitalist doesn't turn surplus value into capital by selling those commodities and that labor. He does the reverse, consuming or spending surplus value as revenue. Since the old aristocratic sensibility consists, as Hegel rightly says, in consuming what is available, and is particularly evident in the opulence of personal retainers, bourgeois political economy found it crucially important to stress that the gospel of the new society, i.e., the accumulation of capital, preaches the use of surplus value to buy productive workers as its conditio sine qua non. On the other hand, bourgeois political economy had to counter a popular stereotype that confuses capitalist production with amassing stores of wealth. and therefore wrongly imagines that accumulated wealth is wealth that has been saved from destruction in its natural form. In other words, withdrawn from consumption or spared circulation. To hold money out of circulation would be the opposite of valorizing it as capital. And the accumulation of the accumulation of commodities as it is carried out by the wealth amasser would be pure foolishness. Commodities accumulate in large masses either when circulation stagnates or overproduction occurs. But of course, the sight of goods stored up and meant for gradual consumption by the rich impresses the popular imagination, as does the formation of a reserve, a phenomenon common to all modes of production, and one we will take a moment to consider in analyzing the circulation process. Classical political economy was thus right to frame the consumption of surplus product by productive workers rather than their non-productive counterparts as a characteristic feature of the accumulation process. Yet this point is also precisely where political economy's misconception begins. Adam Smith made it fashionable to see accumulation as nothing more than what happens when productive workers consume surplus product, or to see the capitalization of surplus value as nothing more than what happens when surplus value is turned into labor power. Let's listen to Ricardo. It must be understood that all the productions of a country are consumed, but it makes the greatest difference imaginable whether they are consumed by those who reproduce or by those who do not reproduce another value. Now, when we say that revenue is saved and added to capital, what we mean is that the portion of revenue so said to be added to capital is consumed by productive instead of unproductive laborers. There can be no greater error in supposing that capital is increased by non-consumption. There can be no greater error than the one committed by Smith and mindlessly repeated by Ricardo and the whole lot that came after him, which is to believe that the portion of revenue so said to be added to capital is consumed by productive laborers. According to this view, all surplus value that is transformed into capital turns into variable capital. But like the capital originally advanced, surplus value is divided. It becomes both constant and variable capital, means of production and labor power. Labor power is the form in which variable capital exists during the production process. Here, a capitalist consumes labor power, and labor power, or rather its function, labor, consumes the means of production. At the same time, the productive worker, not productive labor, consumes the means of subsistence that the money advanced for labor power is turned into. By way of a fundamentally wrong-headed analysis, Adam Smith arrived at the absurd position that even though every individual mass of capital is divided into constant and variable components, society's capital only goes into variable capital. In other words, society's capital is spent only to pay workers' wages. Now, let's say that a cloth manufacturer turns 2,000 pounds into capital. He spends one part of the money to buy weavers and the other to purchase woolen yarn, machinery, and so on. The people from whom he buys the yarn and machinery and then buy labor with part of the money they have gotten from him and so on until to purchase woolen yarn, machinery, and so on. The people from whom he buys the yarn and machinery then buy labor with part of the money they have gotten from him and so on until the whole 2,000 pounds has been spent on wages, or that is, until productive workers have consumed all the products represented by the 2,000 pounds. We can see that the nub of this argument is contained in the phrase, and so on, which sends us from pillar to post. In fact, Smith breaks off the analysis just where the difficult part begins. In the second volume of the present book, or chapter 3 of that volume, I will analyze how this connection actually works, and in doing so, show how the dogma inherited by all of Smith's successors prevented political economy from understanding even the elementary mechanism of the social reproduction process. Section 3, the division of surplus value into capital and revenue, the abstinence theory. In the previous chapter, we considered surplus value or surplus product only as a capitalist individual consumption fund. In this chapter, we've been considering it only as his accumulation fund. But it isn't simply one thing or the other. Rather, it is both at the same time. The capitalist consumes one part of the surplus value as revenue and uses another part as capital, i.e., for accumulation. Now, if the amount of surplus value is given, the magnitude of accumulation clearly depends on how surplus value is divided into the fund for consumption and the fund for accumulation and into revenue and capital. The larger the one part, the smaller the other. The amount of surplus value or surplus product, and thus of a country's available wealth that can be turned into capital is therefore always larger than the part of the surplus value that is in fact turned into capital. This difference increases in proportion to how far capitalist production has advanced in a given country, the speed and scale of accumulation there, how wealthy the country is, and finally, its consumption of and spending on luxury goods, which become more and more enormous as the country's wealth grows. If we set aside the wealth in the capitalist consumption fund that comes from annual growth, each part of the wealth there, which can be consumed only gradually, exists in natural forms that can function directly as capital. All bearers of labor power who weren't employed at all or who are being used for conventional, often disreputable services of a purely personal kind count as available elements of wealth that can function in the production process. The ratio in which surplus value is divided into capital and revenue varies constantly and is determined by circumstances that we don't need to explicate any further here. This means that the capital used in a given country isn't a fixed magnitude. Rather, it fluctuates. It is always variable. It is an always variable and elastic piece of the available wealth and can function as capital. The surplus value or surplus product produced by the worker and constantly appropriated by the capitalist presents itself to the latter as the regular fructifying of his capital, or the product of another person's labor, which he gets without paying any kind of equivalent, constitutes a regular supplement to his personal wealth. So naturally, the division of this surplus value or surplus product into additional capital and a fund for consumption is mediated by an act of will on his part. Only insofar as the capitalist is personified capital does he have historical value and the historical right to exist that, as the clever Lichnowsky once put it, has not no date. Only to the extent that this is so is the capitalist's own transitory necessity implied by the transitory necessity of the capitalist mode of production. But at the same time, insofar as the capitalist is personified capital, his driving motivation is to have more and more exchange value, not to acquire use value and experience pleasure. A fanatic, when it comes to the valorization of value, he ruthlessly forces human beings to produce for production's sake. He thereby forces people to develop social productive powers and also to create material conditions of production that represent the only real foundation for a higher form of society whose basic principle is the full and free development of each individual. The capitalist is respectable only as the personification of capital. As such, he has an absolute drive to enrich himself, just as the wealth amasser does. In addition, every individual capitalist is forced to continually expand his capital just to keep it, owing to the immanent laws of the capitalist mode of production that competition imposes on capitalists as compulsory external laws. Thus, insofar as the capitalist's behavior is merely a function of the capital that has taken on consciousness and a will in him, he sees his own private consumption as an act of theft committed against the accumulation of his capital, which is in fact how it is treated in Italian double entry bookkeeping. The capitalist's private expenses are put down as counting against his capital. To accumulate capital is to conquer the world of social wealth. As accumulation enlarges the quantity of exploited human material, it expands the capitalist's direct and indirect domination. But the original sin is at work everywhere. As the capitalist modes of production, accumulation, and wealth all develop further, the capitalist ceases to be merely capital incarnate. He feels human compassion for his own Adam and is educated in a way that lets him smile at his former mania for asceticism, which he sees as a prejudice harbored by the old-fashioned wealth amasser. A capitalist in the classical mold decries individual consumption, labeling it a sin against his own function as well as abstinence from accumulation. In contrast, the modernized capitalist is able to see accumulation as the renunciation of his pleasure drive. Two souls, alas, do dwell within his breast. The one is ever parting from the other. When the capitalist mode of production was in its infancy, a historical stage that every capitalist parvenu still has to go through, the drive to attain wealth and thrift reigned as absolute passions. But as capitalist production advanced further, its progress brought into being not only a world of delights, but also speculation and credit that introduced 1,000 ways to get rich fast. At a certain stage in this development, a conventional amount of private spending becomes a business necessity for the unhappy capitalist. And it functions as a way to display wealth and thus also establish credit. Luxury articles are now part of capital's self-representation costs. In any case, unlike the wealth amasser, the capitalist doesn't get rich in proportion to how much labor he performs and how much he refrains from personal consumption, but rather according to the extent to which he sucks up the labor power of other people and can force workers to renounce all of life's pleasures. The capitalist's private spending is thus never authentic in the way that the dissolute feudal lord's was. Ugly miserliness and anxious calculation lurk in the background at all times. The capitalist's private spending nevertheless grows as his accumulation increases without the one thing necessarily impeding the other. As this happens, a Faustian conflict takes shape in the capital individualist's breast, where the drive for accumulation clashes with his pleasure drive. The trade of Manchester, writes Dr. Aiken in a work published in 1795, may be divided into 4 periods. The first is that the manufacturers worked hard merely for a livelihood. They acquired wealth mainly by robbing parents who sent their boys to apprentice with them. The parents had to pay high fees for this while their sons were made to go without food. But average profits were low, and under these circumstances, extreme thrift had to be brought forth in order for accumulation to occur. The manufacturers lived like wealth amassers, not even consuming the interest on their capital. The second period is that when they had to acquire that as when they the second period is that when they had begun to acquire little fortunes but worked hard as before, for it costs labor to directly exploit labor, as every slave driver knows, and they lived in as plain a manner as before. The third is that when luxury began to appear and trade was pushed by sending out riders for orders to every market town in the kingdom, it is probable that few or no capitals of £3,000 to £4,000 acquired by trade existed here before 1690. However, about that time, or a little later, the traders had certainly got money beforehand and began to build modern brick houses in place of those of wood and plaster. As late as the early part of the 18th century, a Manchester manufacturer who, having a valuable customer to sup with him, sent to the tavern for a pint of foreign wine, furnished a subject for the sarcastic remarks of all his neighbors. Prior to the rise of machines, how did manufacturers spend in the pubs where they all gathered? On an average evening, they didn't spend more than sixpence for a glass of punch and one pence for a roll of tobacco. It wasn't until 1758, and this was epoch making, that a manufacturer could be seen with a carriage of his own. The fourth period, the last third of the 18th century, is that in which expense and luxury had made a great progress and was supported by a trade extended by means of riders and factors through every part of Europe. What would the good Mr. Aiken say if he were resurrected in today's Manchester? Accumulate, accumulate. This is Moses and the prophets. Industry provides the subject which parsimony accumulates. So save, save, reverse transform as much surplus value or surplus product as you can. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, production for the sake of production. These were the phrases classical political economy used to articulate the historical calling of the bourgeois period. Not even for a second did it deceive itself about the birth pains of wealth. But what's the use of complaining about a historical necessity if classical political economy treats the proletarian merely as a machine for producing surplus value? It treats the capitalist as nothing but a machine for transforming that surplus value into surplus capital. Classical political economy is grimly serious in its approach to the capitalist historical function. In the early 1820s, Malthus tried to rid his breast of the unhealthy conflict between the pleasure drive and the drive for wealth, defending a division of labor that assigned the business of accumulation to capitalists actually engaged in production, and the business of spending to the other people who claimed a share of surplus value, that is, the landed aristocracy, holders of state and church sinecures, and so on. It is of the utmost importance, he said, to keep separate the passion for expenditure and the passion for accumulation. The Messrs. Capitalists, who had long since become pleasure seekers and men of the world, howled in protest. One of their spokesmen, a student of Ricardo, exclaimed, "What? Is Mr. Malthus preaching high rents, high taxes, etc., as a way of seeing to it that non-productive consumers will constantly spur on industrious manufacturers?" Yes, production. Production on an ever-increasing scale, so runs the shibboleth. But production is surely checked much more than it is promoted by this process, nor is it quite fair to keep a number of persons idle in this manner merely in order to pinch those who are likely, from their characters, if you can force them to work with to some purpose. Now, while this author found it terribly unfair to motivate industrial capitalists by taking the meat from their soup, he was just as adamant in claiming that the workers' wages must be held to the lowest possible level in order to, quote, keep him industrious, unquote. Nor did he make any attempt to conceal that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the secret to turning a profit. Quote, increased demand by the workers is a disposition to take less themselves and leave a greater share for their employers. And if it be said that this, by diminishing consumption on the workers' part, increased glut, I can only answer that glut then is synonymous with high profits, unquote. So, of the spoils squeezed out of workers, what part should go to industrious capitalists and how much should indolent landowners get? What sort of division would do the most to foster accumulation? When the July Revolution broke out, the learned squabbling over these questions ceased. Shortly thereafter, the urban proletariat sounded the cry of revolutions at Lyon, and its rural counterpart began to set barns and hayricks ablaze in England. Owenism spread rapidly on this side of the Channel. Saint-Simonism and Fourierism spread as fast on the other side. The hour of vulgar political economy had arrived exactly 1 year before Nassau W. Sr. determined that capital's profit, including interest, is produced by the unpaid last of the 12 hours of labor. He announced to the world a different discovery. He said solemnly, I substitute for the word capital, considered as an instrument of production, the word abstinence. Truly an unsurpassed example of the quote unquote discoveries we find in vulgar political economy. It replaces economic categories with sycophantic phrases. Voilà tout. Quote, when the savage makes bows, Senior informs us, quote, he exercises an industry, but he does not practice abstinence, unquote. This is supposed to explain how and why the means of labor were made in earlier stages of society without the abstinence of the capitalist. Quote, the more society progresses, the more abstinence is demanded, unquote, namely from those people in the business of appropriating the industry and products of others. All the things required for the labor process now become acts of capitalist abstinence. If some grain isn't eaten but is sown instead, abstinence of the capitalist. If wine is given time to mature, abstinence of the capitalist. The capitalist steals from his own atom whenever he lends the instruments of production to the worker, i.e., valorizes those instruments as capital by incorporating into them labor power instead of eating up steam machines, cotton, railways, manure, horses, and so on. Or, as the vulgar economist childishly imagines, burning through, quote unquote, their value in luxury goods and other articles for consumption. How the capitalist class is supposed to accomplish such a feat is a secret that vulgar political economy has stubbornly refused to disclose. It is enough to know that only one thing sustains the world, the self-flagellation of that modern-day pendant of Vishnu, the capitalist. Not only accumulation, but also the conservation of capital requires a constant effort to resist the temptation to consume it, unquote. Clearly, the only humane course of action would be to deliver the capitalist from his temptation and martyrdom, just as slave owners in Georgia were delivered from the following painful dilemma not long ago when slavery was abolished. Should they opt for high spirits and put the whole surplus product whipped out of slaves into champagne? Or should they drink less and reverse transform some of the surplus product into more Negroes and land? It isn't only simple reproduction that occurs in the most diverse economic formations of society. Reproduction on an ever larger scale does as well, although its dimensions have varied from place to place. More and more product is produced and consumed, and so more product is transformed into means of production, but this process will not appear as the accumulation of capital. Hence, as a function of the capitalist, as long as the worker hasn't begun to encounter his means of production in the form of capital, and therefore his product and means of subsistence too. Richard Jones focuses on two important facts. In a useful discussion of this point, Jones, who died a few years ago, took over Malthus's chair in political economy at Haileybury. Because self-supporting peasants make up the largest part of India's population, their products, means of labor, and means subsistence never exist in the shape of a fund that is saved from revenue and has therefore gone through a previous process of accumulation. At the same time, the provinces where the old system has changed comparatively little under English rule, non-agricultural workers work directly for magnates who receive a portion of the rural surplus product as tribute or ground rent. The magnates consume one part of this product in its natural form, while workers make them luxury goods and other articles of consumption out of another part. Now, the rest goes into the wages of the workers who own their instruments of labor. Production and reproduction on an ever larger scale take place without any help from that strange saint, that knight of the sorrowful continents, the abstaining capitalist. Section 4. The circumstances that determine the extent of accumulation independently of the division of surplus value into capital and revenue. The degree to which labor power is exploited. labor's productive power, the magnitude of the capital advanced, the ever increasing difference between the magnitude of the capital employed and the capital consumed. We have been treating the amount of surplus value as a given magnitude. When we do that, how surplus value is divided between revenue and surplus capital determines how much accumulation occurs. But the amount of accumulation also varies independently of this division, varying as the magnitude of the surplus value does. In the chapters that deal with how surplus value is produced, we explicated at length the circumstances that regulate its magnitude. If all other conditions remain the same, these circumstances regulate the movement of accumulation as well. We will come back to them here only insofar as they give us new perspectives on accumulation. Now, recall the role that the degree of labor's exploitation plays in the production of surplus value. Political economy ascribes so much importance to this role that it wrongly identifies accelerating accumulation caused by labor's increased productive power as the accelerating accumulation that results when the exploitation of labor intensifies. In the above-mentioned sections on the production of surplus value, we always assumed that wages were at least equal to the value of labor power. Moreover, we showed that wages, whether in terms of their value or in the amount of means of subsistence they represent, can rise, even as the degree of labor's exploitation increases. But in the practical movement of capital, surplus value is also produced by forcibly driving wages below the value of labor power. Now, what happens in effect is that part of the worker's necessary fund for consumption is turned into capital's accumulation fund. Wages, says John Stuart, have no productive power. They are the price of a productive power. Wages do not contribute, along with labor, to the production of commodities, no more than the price of tools contributes along with the tools themselves. If labor could be had without purchase, wages might be dispensed with. Of course, if workers could live on a diet of air, they wouldn't sell themselves at any price. The point at which they cost nothing is thus a limit in the mathematical sense. One can always get closer to it without ever being able to reach it. Capital has a permanent tendency to reduce wages toward this 0 point. An 18th century writer whom I have cited quite a few times, the author of the Essay on Trade and Commerce, betrays the innermost secret of English capital when he declares that England's historical mission is to lower its workers' wages to the level of their French and Dutch counterparts. He naively states, but if our poor, a technical term for workers, will live luxuriously, their labor must of course be dear. One has only to consider what egregious luxuries the manufacturing populace consume, such as brandy, gin, tea, sugar, foreign fruit, strong beer, printed linen, snuff, tobacco, etc. He quotes a work by a Northamptonshire manufacturer who, looking up at the heavens with a sour expression, proceeds to whine, quote, labor is 1/3 cheaper in France than it is in England, for their poor work hard and fare hard, and as to their food and clothing, their chief diet is bread, fruit, herbs, roots, and dried fish. For they very seldom eat flesh, and when wheat is dear, they eat very little bread, unquote. To which may be added, our essayist continues, quote, that their drink is either water or other small liquor, so that they may spend very little money. These things are very difficult to be brought about, but they're not impracticable, since they have been effected both in France and in Holland. 20 years later, unquote, 20 years later, an American humbug, the ennobled Yankee Benjamin Thompson, alias Count Rumford, took up the same line of philanthropy, pleasing both God and man. His essays are a cookbook full of recipes for using surrogates to get around the high normal price of the worker's means of subsistence. Now, one of the more successful recipes this philosophical marvel offers is as follows: 5 pounds of barley meal, 1.5 shillings, sorry, 5 pounds of Indian corn, 6 1/4 shillings, 3 shillings worth of red herring, one shilling salt, 1 shilling vinegar, 2 shillings pepper and sweet herbs, all in all 20 and 3/4 shilling. Make a soup for 64 men at the medium price of barley and of Indian corn. The cost per portion can be kept as low as a quarter shilling per person. But as capitalist production advanced further, the adulteration of commodities rendered Thompson's strategy superfluous. At the end of the 18th century and during the first decade of the 19th century, English farmers and landowners managed to force wages down to the absolute minimum by paying agricultural wage workers less than the minimum in the form of actual wages and the rest as parish relief. What sort of buffoonery did these English Dogberries engage in as they legally established a wage tariff? Here is one example. Quote, "The squires of Norfolk had dined, says Mr. Burke, when they fixed the rate of wages. The squires of Burke's evidently thought that the laborers ought not to do so when they fixed the rate of wages at Speenhamland, 1795. There they decided that weekly income should be three 3 shillings for a man, and when the gallon or half peck loaf of 8 pounds 11 ounces is at 1 shilling, and increase regularly until bread is at 1 shilling 5 pence. When it is above that sum, decrease regularly till it be at 2 shillings, and then his food should be a fifth less." Before the House of Lords Committee of Inquiry, a certain Mr. Bennett, a big farmer, magistrate, poor law guardian, and wage regulator, was asked in 1814, "Has any proportion of the value of daily labor been made up to the laborers out of the poor's rate?" Answer: yes, it has. The weekly income of every family is made up to the gallon loaf, 8 pounds 11 ounces, and 3 pence per head. The gallon loaf per week is what we suppose sufficient for the maintenance of every person in the family for the week. And the 3 pence is for clothes, and if the parish think it proper to fine clothes, the 3 pence is deducted. This practice goes through all the western part of Wiltshire, and I believe throughout the country, unquote. For years, exclaimed a contemporary bourgeois writer, quote, "the farmers have degraded a respectable class of their countrymen by forcing them to have recourse to the workhouse. The farmer, while increasing his own gains, has prevented any accumulation on the part of his laboring dependents," unquote. The example of so-called domestic industry shows us what role directly stealing from the worker's necessary consumption fund now plays in the formation of surplus value and thus also capital's accumulation fund. Further facts will be provided below. Within certain limits, labor power's elasticity, i.e. its capacity to be activated more intensely or extensively, serves as an independent source for creating additional wealth and therefore increasing the accumulation fund as a source not dependent on the size of the means of production that have already been produced and are actually functioning. In other words, constant capital's material elements. In extractive industries such as mining, the object of labor exists ready-made in nature. Thus, if the necessary means of labor are given, and for the most part the extractive industries themselves supply the raw materials for the instruments of labor, i.e. or e.g. metal, wood, and auxiliary materials such as coal, the amount of product produced is hardly limited by the size of those means. They are merely used up faster when more labor power is expended. Their reproduction period is shortened. In contrast, the amount of the actual product, that is, coal, iron, etc., increases in proportion to the amount of labor being applied to the natural object, provided all other conditions remain constant. The original agents that came together to create products, human beings and nature, go together here, just as on the first day of production, and thus so do the agents that create the material elements of capital. In agriculture proper, of course, seed and fertilizer play the same role as raw material in industrial production. Additional soil can't be planted if there is no additional seed. But when this raw material and the instruments of labor are given, the application of purely mechanical labor, the intensity of which depends on how labor power is activated, has a wonderful effect on the amount of product produced, as is well known. Once again, human activity applied directly to a natural object becomes an immediate source of wealth. On the other hand, The extractive industries and agriculture supply industrial production with raw materials and auxiliary materials or with the material elements that large-scale expenditures of labor require. While in this sphere, too, when labor power is activated more intensely or extensively, the reproduction period of the actual means of labor is merely shortened. So, when capital incorporates into itself the original co-creators of wealth, labor power, and the earth, it acquires elastic factors of reproduction on an ever larger scale and thus also of accumulation that don't depend on its material dimensions. Aside from the degree to which labor is exploited, it is labor's productive power that fundamentally determines how much surplus value is produced. And since surplus value is the basic element of accumulation, how much capital is accumulated? When labor's productive power increases, so does the amount of product in which a certain amount of value, and thus also a given magnitude of surplus value, is represented. The amount of surplus product will increase as the rate of surplus value remains constant, or even if that rate falls, as long as it falls more slowly than labor's productive power increases. Thus, when the division of the surplus product into revenue and surplus capital remains the same, the capitalist can increase his consumption without causing the fund for accumulation to decrease. The relative magnitude of the accumulation fund can, in fact, increase at the expense of the consumption fund, even as the capitalist gets to have at least as many objects of enjoyment as before because commodities have become cheaper. But, as we have seen, labor's increased productivity goes hand in hand with a cheaper worker, and thus a higher rate of surplus value, even when real wages rise. Wages never rise in proportion to the increases in labor's productive power. The same amount of value advanced as variable capital sets more labor power and therefore more labor in motion. The same amount of value advanced as constant capital is represented in a greater quantity of the means of production, i.e. more means of labor, material of labor, and auxiliary material. So it supplies more of the agents that create products and value, more of the things that absorb labor. Hence, even if the value of the surplus capital remains constant or in fact decreases, accumulation still accelerates. The material scale of reproduction expands, and in addition, the production of surplus value increases faster than the value of the surplus capital. When labor's productive power increases, this affects the original capital. Capital has already been put into the production process. One part of the functioning constant capital is made up of means of labor, for example, machines that take longer periods to wear out and are therefore reproduced or replaced over longer periods. But every year, some of these means of labor die or reach the end of their productive service. Every year, then, some will be in the stage where their regular reproduction occurs. In other words, they will need to be replaced by new units of the same type. If labor's productive power increases in the birthplaces of these means of labor, which in fact happens continuously because science and technology advance nonstop, then the old machines, tools, and apparatuses will be replaced by ones that do more but cost less in terms of what they accomplish. The old capital is reproduced in a more productive form, aside from the fact that the already functioning means of labor are always being improved in small ways. The other part of the constant capital, namely raw material and auxiliary material, is reproduced continuously during the year, with the part that comes from agricultural tending to be reproduced annually. Now, whatever better methods are introduced here, the additional capital and the capital in operation are thus affected at more or less the same time. Every advance in chemistry not only multiplies the useful applications of a single material, thereby enlarging capital spheres of investment while increasing its growth, it also shows how to take the waste excreted by the production and consumption processes and hurl that waste back into the cycle of the reproduction process, i.e., how to create new material for capital without a new outlay of capital. Science functions as a power that enlarges capital, but doesn't depend on how much of it has been advanced, just as simply activating labor power more intensely increases the exploitation of natural resources. Science also reacts on the part of the original capital that has entered the renewal stage. Free of charge, this capital incorporates into its new form the social progress that was achieved behind the back of its old form. Of course, a partial depreciation of the functioning capital goes along with such gain in productive power. But insofar as the depreciation is acutely felt in competition, the worker bears the brunt of it. For the capitalist seeks to make up for his loss by intensifying the exploitation of labor. When we analyze relative surplus value, we saw that advances in labor's social productive power necessitate that the amount of constant capital set in motion by the same labor power keeps increasing. The value of the old capital is preserved, and in this sense, reproduced simply through the addition of new labor or when new value is produced. And the amount of this capital increases along with the wealth, i.e., the extent and effectiveness of the labor objectified in machines and so on, which is the already produced condition required for the production process or where the worker's labor begins. Compare, for example, an English spinner and his Indian counterpart. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that the English and Indian work days are equally long and intense. In the course of a day, the English spinner transforms into yarn hundreds of times as much cotton, spinning instruments, and so on. He thus preserves hundreds of times as much capital value in his product. Even if the amount of new value he produces daily or adds to the means of production is equal to the amount the Indian spinner produces, his daily labor is represented in not only a larger quantity of product, but also the product's infinitely greater amounts of value, which comes from the old capital that the English spinner transfers to the new product and can function anew as capital. As Friedrich Engels informs us, in 1782, the whole wool crop of the preceding 3 years in England lay unused for want of workers. And it would have continued to lie if the newly invented machinery had not come to its assistance and spun it. The labor objectified in the forms of machines didn't bring forth human beings from the earth, at least not directly, but it did allow a smaller number of workers supplying relatively little living labor to both consume the wool productively, and thus add new value to it, and preserve its old value in the form of yarn, etc. This labor thereby provided both the means and the impetus for increasing the reproduction of wool. Living labor's natural gift is its ability to preserve old value as it creates new value. Labor, therefore, preserves and perpetuates a constantly growing amount of capital value in a form that is always new, doing so as its extent and effectiveness and also the value of its means of production increase. Hence, as accumulation occurs, the accumulation that accompanies advances in labor's productive power. This natural power on labor's part appears as the power to self-preserve on the part of the capital into which labor is incorporated, just as the social productive powers of labor appear as characteristics of capital, and just as the capitalist's constant appropriation of surplus labor appears as capital's constant self-valorization. All the powers of labor appear as powers belonging to capital, just as all the commodities' value forms appear as forms of money. Lastly, if all other conditions remain constant, how much surplus value is produced? And thus, the accumulation that occurs is determined by how much capital is advanced. When the total capital increases, the variable capital does as well, although not in the same proportion. The larger the scale on which the individual capitalist produces, the greater the number of workers he exploits at the same time, or the greater the amount of unpaid labor he appropriates. So, the more an individual mass of capital is enlarged, the greater the fund that is divided between a fund for consumption and one for accumulation. The capitalist can therefore live more extravagantly as his renouncing increases. As the amount of capital grows, so too does the difference between the capital employed and the capital consumed. In other words, the value and physical size of the means of labor increase. For example, buildings, machines, drain pipes, working cattle, and all kinds of apparatuses that function in their entirety for a shorter or longer amount of time in constantly repeated production processes, or that gradually wear down as they serve to produce certain useful effects, thus losing their value only piecemeal and transferring it to the product in the same way, in the same proportion as these means of labor serve to build products but don't add value to the products they help build, or operate as a whole but are consumed only piecemeal. They perform, as we saw earlier, a free service, just like the one provided by such natural forces as water, steam, air, electricity, and so on. Once this free service supplied by past labor has been seized upon and animated by living labor, it accumulates as the scale of accumulation keeps increasing. The bourgeois and the political economists are always full of praise for the services performed by past labor because it always disguises itself as capital. The passivum of A's, B's, and C's labor is disguised as the activum of the non-worker X. McCulloch, that Scottish genius, even thought that such labor should draw a salary of its own. Hence, the ever-growing importance of the past labor that participates in the living labor process in the form of the means of production is attributed to the form this past labor takes when it is alienated from the worker, whose past and unpaid labor it in fact is, namely the capital form. The practical agents of capitalist production and their garrulous ideologues can't conceive of the means of production without the antagonistic social actors mask these means wear today, any more than the slave owner can conceive of a worker apart from his character as a slave. Number 5, Section 5, the so-called labor fund. Our investigation has shown that capital isn't a fixed magnitude. Instead, it's an elastic part of social wealth that fluctuates constantly as surplus value is divided between revenue and surplus capital. We have also seen that even when the magnitude of the functioning capital is given, it has elastic powers, thanks to the labor power, science, and land incorporated into it. Economically speaking, land means all the objects of labor that are available in nature ready-made, i.e., prior to human activity. Within certain limits, these things afford capital latitude that is independent of its size. When we made this point, we disregarded all the relations in the circulation process that cause the same amount of capital to have different degrees of effectiveness. And since we presuppose the limits set by capitalist production, or a purely spontaneous form of the social production process, we also disregarded all the more rational and systematic combinations that might be directly brought about using the available means of production and bearers of labor power. Classical political economy has always loved to treat society's capital as a fixed magnitude whose degree of effectiveness doesn't vary. But this prejudice didn't harden into an actual dogma until the arch-Philistine Jeremy Bentham got a hold of it. Bentham, that sober, pedantic, lumbering oracle of bourgeois common sense in the 19th century. His place among philosophers is like Martin Tupper's among poets. Both could only have been produced in England. Bentham's dogma rendered the most ordinary phenomena of the production process, its sudden expansion and contraction, and even accumulation, completely incomprehensible. It was put to apologetic use by Bentham himself, Malthus, James Mill, McCulloch, and so on. In particular, it has served as a means of portraying one part of capital, the variable part that is turned into labor power, as a fixed magnitude. Now, according to the fable put forth here, variable capital in its material existence, in other words, as the amount of means of subsistence that it represents for the worker, or as the so-called labor fund, is a separate part of society's wealth, which is kept away from all others by natural chains. A certain amount of living labor is required to set in motion the part of society's wealth that is supposed to function as constant capital, or expressed in the form of things as the means of production. This amount is fixed by technology, but the number of workers needed to make this quantity of labor fluid isn't fixed. Rather, it varies with the degree to which individual bearers of labor power are exploited. Nor is the price of labor power fixed. Only its minimal limit is, and here we have a price limit with quite a bit of elasticity. Now, the facts on which Bentham's dogma is based are as follows. Now, on the one hand, the worker has no say in how society's wealth is divided between objects of employment for non-workers and means of production. Only in exceptionally favorable cases, on the other hand, can the worker enlarge the so-called labor fund at the expense of the revenue of the rich. Using the example of Professor Fawcett, we can see what kind of absurd tautology results when the capitalist limits of the labor fund are fancifully recast as its natural social limits. The circulating capital of a country, Fawcett says, is its wage fund. Hence, if we desire to calculate the average money wages received by each worker, we have simply to divide the amount of this capital by the number of laboring population. Unquote. In other words, first we divide up all the individual wages that are actually paid, and then we assert that the total we get represents the value sum of the labor fund guaranteed by God and nature. Finally, we divide this sum by the number of workers in order to discover the average wage an individual worker can receive. What an uncommonly clever procedure this is, which doesn't stop Mr. Fawcett from saying in the same breath, quote, the aggregate wealth which is annually saved in England is divided into two portions. One portion is employed as capital to maintain our industry, and the other portion is exported to foreign countries. Only a portion, and perhaps not a large portion, of the wealth which is annually saved in this country is invested in our own industry. Most of the annually accruing surplus product, which is taken from the English worker without an equivalent, is thus used as capital in foreign countries, not in England. When surplus capital is exported in this way, part of the labor fund invented by God and Bentham leaves with it. So we got to the end of the chapter with a little bit of time over. And let me go through the endnotes and the editor's notes. Number one, accumulation of capital, the employment of a portion of revenue as capital, Malthus. Labor creates capital, therefore, before capital employs labor, Wakefield, 1833. Number three, just as a certain stage in its development, commodity production necessarily becomes capitalist commodity production. In fact, it's solely on the basis of capitalist production that the commodity becomes the predominant form of products. The laws of property based on commodity production are necessarily inverted and become the laws of capitalist appropriation. We might therefore marvel at Proudhon's cleverness, given that he proposed to abolish capitalist property by enforcing the eternal property laws based on commodity production. Number four, that the capitalist owns other people's labor is, quote, a strict consequence of the law of appropriation, the fundamental principle of which was the reverse, the exclusive entitlement of the worker to the product of his own labor. Chebouillet, 1841, where, however, this dialectical inversion isn't properly represented. Editor's note, Marx seems to be thinking of this line on page 104, quote, now this is one of the most striking results of the law of appropriation. The absolute increase in wealth, that is to say, in the products of labor, does not lead to a proportional increase and can lead to a decrease in provisions for workers in the share of all the species of products that falls to them. Number five, Malthus, quote, capital consists of wealth saved from revenue and used with a view to profit, unquote. Number six is a letter to Lord John Russell. Number seven, capital with compound interest on every portion of capital saved is so engrossing that all the wealth in the world from which income is derived has long ago become interest on capital. That's from the London Economist of 1851. And note 8, no political economist of the present day can, by saving, mean more hoarding And beyond this contracted and insufficient proceeding, no use of the term in reference to the national wealth can well be imagined. But that which must arise from a different application of what is saved, founded upon a real distinction between the different kinds of labor maintained by it, unquote. Editor's note, the wording in the source text is inefficient proceeding rather than insufficient proceeding. Accumulation of stocks, non-exchange overproduction, note 9, Courbet. Number 10 is Ricardo, note number 11. Despite his logic, Mr. J. St. Mill never managed to identify even such a faulty analysis in the work of his predecessors. It cries out to be fixed, even from a purely technical standpoint, or even in terms of what the bourgeois can see. No matter. At every turn, Mill displays the intellectual confusion of his masters, registering it with the dogmatism of a schoolboy. For example, quote, the capital itself in the long run becomes entirely wages and replaced by the sale of produce becomes wages again, unquote. Editor's note, the quoted sentence which Marx gives in English couldn't be found in Mill's work. What comes closest are these lines from his essays on some unsettled questions of political economy. Quote, to replace capital is to replace nothing but the wages of the labor employed. Consequently, the whole of the surplus after replacing wages is profits, unquote. And note 12, in his account of the reproduction process and thus of accumulation, Adam Smith not only made no progress in certain respects, he went decisively backward compared to his predecessors, especially the physiocrats. The allusion of his mentioned in the body of this text goes together with a truly fantastic dogma, also inherited by political economy. The price of commodities is made up of wages, profit, that is interest, and ground rent, that is merely of wages and surplus value. Proceeding from this basis, Storch at least naively confesses it is impossible to resolve the necessary price into its simplest elements. Storch, 1815. Now, what a wonderful economics, that unquote, what a wonderful economic science this is. It declares that the prices of commodities cannot be resolved in their simplest elements. This point will be discussed in detail in chapter 7 of volume 3. And note 13, readers will note that the word revenue is being used in two senses. First, to signify surplus value as the fruit that arises periodically from capital. And second, to signify the part of that fruit which is periodically consumed by the capitalist or put into his fund of consumption. I've retained this double meaning because it aligns with the usage of English and French political economists. Number 14, using the figure of the usurer, that old-fashioned form of capitalist that is always being renewed, Martin Luther ably shows how lust for power is an element in the drive for wealth. Quote, the heathens draw on their reason to determine that a usurer is a thief and murderer in more ways than one, yet we Christians esteem them so much because of their money that we in fact worship them. Whoever sucks away, robs, and steals another's sustenance, that man commits as great a murder, so far as he is responsible, as someone who starves a man or ruins him entirely. That is what a usurer does. But he sits in his chair, safe and secure, when he ought rather to be hanging on the gallows, when he ought to be eaten by a flock of ravens equal to the number of guilders he has stolen. If only there were so much flesh on him that, boring their beaks into it, such a large flock could share it. For now we hang the small thieves. Small thieves are put in the stocks, while big thieves flaunt themselves in gold and silk. Thus, on this earth, there is no greater enemy of man after the devil than a money hoarder and a usurer, for he wants to be God over all men. Turks, soldiers, and tyrants, they too are bad men, yet must they let the people live and confess that they are bad and enemies, and occasionally they do indeed show pity to some. But a usurer and money vermin would have the whole world die of hunger and thirst, misery and want, however much he has, so that he might have all to himself. and so that all would receive from him as from a god and be his serf eternally, wearing fine cloaks, golden chains and rings, wiping his mouth, being seen as a worthy, pious man. Usury is a great monster, like a werewolf who decimates everything more than any Cacus, Geryon, or Antaeus. And yet, this monster decks himself out and wants to appear pious so that people might not see that he's brought the oxen to his hole, making them walk backwards. But Hercules will see the cry of the oxen and of his prisoners, and he will search for Cacus even in cliffs and among rocks. He will free the oxen from the villain. For Cacus means the villain who is a pious usurer who steals, robs, and eats everything and will not acknowledge that he has done it, thinking no one will find him out, because the hoof prints of the oxen led backwards into his den make it seem that they've been let out. Thus, the usurer wants to deceive the world as though he were useful and gave the world oxen, which, however, he slaughters and eats all alone. And since highwaymen, murderers, and housebreakers are broken on the wheel and beheaded, how much more ought we break ought we to break on the wheel and kill, hunt down, curse, and behead all usurers? It's Martin Luther. And note 15, description of the country from 30 to 40 miles around Manchester. 16 is Adam Smith. 17, even J.B. Say says, quote, the savings of the rich are made at the expense of the poor. Editor's note, the source for this quote from Say seems to be Jean Guillaume, Cesar Alexander Hippolyte Collins, um, from his political economy. Quote, the Roman proletariat lived almost entirely at the expense of society. We could say that modern society lives at the expense of the proletarian from the share it takes from him of the recompense for his own work. Quote from Sismondi. 18, 19, 20, Malthus. 21, Senior, Nassau Senior. 1836. Editor's note, these lines don't seem to correspond directly to a text by Senior. They come from a French digest of Senior's economic thought, which Marx cites above. This was too much for those who belonged to the old classical school. Quote, Mr. Senior has substituted for the expression labor and profit the expression labor and abstinence. Abstinence is merely a negation. It is not the abstinence, but the use of capital productively, which is the cause of profits. In contrast, Mr. John Stuart Mill copies Ricardo's theory of profit, but also Senior's remuneration of abstinence. Mill is just as much at home with silly contradictions as he at sea with the Hegelian contradiction, the source of all dialectics. Addendum to the second edition, the vulgar political economist has never bothered to reflect on the simple fact that every human action can be understood as abstinence from its opposite. Eating is abstaining from fasting. Moving is abstaining from standing still. Working is abstaining from lazing about. Lazing about is abstaining from working, and so on. These gentlemen would do well to spend a moment thinking about Spinoza's determino est negatio. 22 is Senior. 23, quote, no one will sow his wheat for itself and allow it to remain a 12-month in the ground and or leave his wine in a cellar for years instead of consuming these things or their equivalent at once unless he expects to acquire additional value. Scrope, 1841. Editor's note, expects to is expects them to in the source text. Number 24, the deprivation that the capitalist imposes on himself by lending. This euphemism is used to equate in the tried and true vulgar economic manner the wage worker exploited by the industrial capitalist with the industrial capitalist himself, who borrows from the money lending capitalist his instruments of production to the worker instead of devoting their value to his own use by transforming them into objects of utility and pleasure. Note 25, of course, Senoi, Note 26, the particular classes of income which yield the most abundantly to the progress of national capital change at different stages of their progress and therefore entirely different in nations occupying different positions in that progress. Profit, unimportant source of accumulation compared with wages and rents in the earlier stage of society, when a considerable advance in the powers of national industry have actually taken place, profits rise into comparative importance as a source of accumulation. This is Jones. 27, Jones. 28, Ricardo says, quote, in different stages of society, the accumulation of capital or of the means of employing, i.e., exploiting labor, is more or less rapid and must in all cases depend on the productive powers of labor. The productive powers of labor are generally greatest when there is an abundance of fertile land. If, in the first sentence, the productive powers of labor mean the smallness of that aliquot part of any produce that goes to those whose manual labor produced it, the sentence is nearly identical, i.e., tautological, because the remaining aliquot part is the fund whence capital can, if the owner pleases, be accumulated. But then this does not generally happen when there is most fertile land. Um, John Stuart Mill, 29, Essays on Some Unsettled Questions of Political Economy, 1844, 30, an essay on trade and commerce, 1770. In December 1866 and January 1867, the Times published similar heartfelt testimonials by English mine owners portraying the happy circumstances of Belgian miners who didn't demand or receive more than was absolutely necessary to keep them alive for their masters. The Belgian workers had put up with a great deal, but to figure in the Times as model workers, this they replied to by striking in Marchienne in February 1867. The strike was suppressed with gunpowder and lead. And note 31, editor's note, Marx's translation of the quota material features some amplifying translation moves. For example, he adds the word egregious before luxuries to point up the author's scorn for the workers' lifestyle. 32, the manufacturer of Northamptonshire commits an act of piafraus, which, given his heart is so full, is pardonable in his case. He makes readers think that he is comparing English and French manufacturing workers, when in fact, the lines just cited depict French agricultural workers, as he eventually follows in his confused way. Note 34, Benjamin Thompson Essays, 1796 to 1802. Sir F.M. Eden warmly recommends the Rumfordian beggar's soup to workhouse overseers, and striking a reproachful tone warns English workers that, quote, many poor people, particularly in Scotland, live very comfortably for months together upon oatmeal and barley meal mixed with only water and salt, unquote. Similar hinting has been done in the 19th century. Various instances will offer themselves to the recollection of every person connected with the laboring classes of the most wholesome mixtures of flour having been during scarcity refused. In Scotland, where education is better, this prejudice is probably unknown. Yet the same Parry complains that the English worker is now, in 1815, in much worse shape than in Eden's time in 1797. Number 35, note, from the reports of the most recent Parliamentary Commission on the adulteration of the means of subsistence, we can see that even the adulteration of medicine is the rule rather than the exception. For example, a test of 34 samples of opium bought in as many London pharmacies revealed that 31 were adulterated with poppy heads, wheat flour, gum, clay, sand, and so on. Quite a few specimens didn't contain even an atom of morphine. 36, Newman, 37, Ibid, 38, Parry. The landlords, for the most part, not only indemnified for their anti-Jacobin war, which they waged in England's name, they also profited from it enormously. Quote, their rents doubled, trebled, quadrupled, and in one sense increased 6 times in 18 years, unquote. Um, 39 is a editor's note on Engels, the condition of the working class in England, um, correcting the passage. And note 40, owing to the deficiencies in its analysis of the labor and valorization processes, classical political economy has never managed to properly grasp this important aspect of reproduction. As the case of Ricardo shows, he says that however much productive power changes, quote, the labor of 1 million men in manufacturers will always produce the same value, unquote. That is correct, assuming that the duration and intensity of their labor does not vary. But in some of his conclusions, Ricardo fails to see that this doesn't prevent 1 million men whose labor varies in its productive power from turning very different amounts of the means of production into products, and thus from preserving different amounts of value in their products. And so the amount of value in the products they produce can vary a great deal. We might note in passing that Ricardo tried without success to use precisely this example to explain to Say, JB Say, how use value, here he calls it wealth or material wealth, differs from exchange value. Say responded as follows, quote, as for the difficulty raised by Mr. Ricardo in saying that by better understood processes, 1 million men can produce twice, 3 times as much wealth without producing more value, this difficulty is not a difficulty when we consider, as we must, production as an exchange in which we give the productive services of our labor, our land, and our capital to obtain products. It is through these productive services that we acquire all the products in the world. Now, we are all the richer. Our productive services have all the more value as they obtain in the exchange called production a greater quantity of useful things, unquote. The difficulty that Say wants to resolve, a difficulty exists for him and not for Ricardo, is this. Why doesn't the value of use values increase when, as a result of labor's enhanced productive power, they increase in number? Answer. The problem is solved if one calls use value exchange value. Exchange value is a thing that is somehow connected to trade. One therefore calls it production when labor, along with the means of production, is exchanged for the product. And it is crystal clear that the more use values production supplies a person with, the more exchange value he acquires. In other words, the more use values, for example, stockings, a workday produces for a manufacturer, the richer he is in stockings. It suddenly occurs to say that, quote, with a greater quantity of stockings, their quote unquote price, which of course has nothing to do with their exchange value, falls because, quote, competition obliges them, the producers, to sell their products for what they cost to make, unquote. But if the capitalist sells commodities for what it costs to make them, where does his profit come from? Never mind, Say explains that because of increased productivity, everyone now receives 2 pairs of stockings in exchange for a given equivalent instead of the 1 pair they had formerly received. In this way, Say arrives at Ricardo's proposition, which is the very one he set out to disprove. Having brought forth this mighty intellectual effort, he is triumphant in addressing Malthus, quote, such, sir, is the well-founded doctrine without which it is impossible, I declare, to explain the greatest difficulties of political economy, in particular, how it can be that a nation is richer when its products decrease in value, even though wealth is value, unquote. An English political economist observes about similar tricks in Say's letters, quote, those affected ways of talking constitute in great part that which Mr. Say calls his doctrine, which he is so anxious to have taught under the auspices of Mr. Malthus at Hertford, as he says it is already in numerous parts of Europe. If you find a paradoxical aspect to all these propositions, look at the things they express, and I dare believe that they will seem very simple and very reasonable to you, doubtless. And at the same time, they will very probably appear by the same process, not at all original or important, unquote. 41. In Volume 3, readers will see that the average rate of profit in different spheres of production isn't affected by each sphere's unique division of capital into constant and variable components, and also that this phenomenon only appears to contradict the laws explicated above, having to do with the nature and production of surplus value. Number 42, McCulloch patented, quote, wages of past labor, unquote, long before Senior patented, quote unquote, wages of abstinence. See, among other texts, in 43, Bentham. 44, Bentham is a purely English phenomenon. Even if we take into account our philosopher Christian Wolff, who we can say that nowhere else and at no other time has the homespun cliche swaggered about with so much self-satisfaction. He didn't invent the principle of utility. In his mindless way, he simply reproduced what Helvetius and other 18th century Frenchmen had said with actual wit and ingenuity. If someone wants to know what is useful for a dog, he has to explain the nature of dogs. Their nature can't be deduced from the quote unquote principle of utility. Now, let's apply this to human beings. A person who would judge all human acts, movements, relations, and so on according to the principle of utility would have to begin by dealing with human nature in general, and then take up human nature as it is modified by each historical epoch. Bentham doesn't bother with this. With the most tedious naivete, he presupposes that the modern petty bourgeois, and in particular the English version, is the normal human being. If something is of use to this odd normal person in his world, then it is useful in and for itself. Bentham applies this yardstick to the past, present, and future. For example, the Christian religion is useful because in the name of religion it disapproves of the same misdeeds that the penal code condemns in the name of the law. Art criticism is harmful because it disturbs upstanding people who want to enjoy Martin Tupper. This is the kind of nonsense with which the good man whose motto is nulla die sine linea has filled mountains of books. If I had the courage of my friend H. Heine, I would say that Mr. Jeremy is a genius of bourgeois stupidity. Editor's note, Christian Wolff, 1679 to 1754, was a rationalist philosopher and a central figure in German intellectual culture during the first half of the 18th century. Martin Tupper was a 19th century English author who tended to operate into a homiletic key. The Latin phrase nulla die sine linea means no day without its line, and is supposed to have been said by the painter Apelles, who believed that an artist had to work at his craft every single day, no exception. This is the Apelles competition that I've referred to before. Number 45. Political economists are too apt to consider a certain quantity of capital and a certain number of laborers as productive instruments of uniform power or operating with a certain uniform intensity. Those who maintain that commodities are the sole agents of production prove that production could never be enlarged, for it requires as an indispensable condition to such an enlargement that food, raw materials, and tools should be previously augmented, which is in fact maintaining that no increase of production can take place without a previous increase, or in other words, that an increase is impossible. Bailey's Money and Its Vicissitudes. Bailey criticizes this dogma mainly from the standpoint of the circulation process. Number 46, in his Principles of Political Economy, John Stuart Mill says, today the product of labor is allotted in inverse proportion to the labor itself. The largest portion goes to those who never work, the next largest to those whose work is close to being merely nominal, and so on downward, with the remuneration contracting more and more as the work grows harder and more unpleasant, until the most wearying and strenuous physical labor, which cannot count with certainty on earning enough to afford even life's basic necessities, unquote. Editor's note, Marx appears to have compiled this passage out of statements Mill makes over a couple of pages in Principles. It is more a collage and paraphrase than a direct quotation. Marx gives the quotation in German, and the parts that couldn't be matched with the source text have been translated from his German edition into English. End of editor's note. To prevent understandings, I will say that while men like John Stuart Mill deserve to be censured for the contradiction between their traditional economic dogmas and their modern thinking, it would be quite unjust to simply lump them together with a pack of vulgar economic apologists. 47 is Fawcett, 1865. Number 48, Marx says, I want to remind readers that I was the first to use the categories variable capital and constant capital. Since Adam Smith, political economy has jumbled together the defining characteristics contained in these categories with purely formal differences that arise from the process of circulation, namely those between fixed capital and circulating capital. For more detailed remarks on this point, see Volume 2, Part 2. 49 is Fawcett. From number 50, the final endnote, one could say that it isn't only capital that is exported each year from England. Workers are too, in the form of emigration. But in the text, nothing is said about the peculium of the emigrants, who for the most part aren't workers. The sons of farmers make up a large percentage of them. The additional capital annually transported abroad so as to be put out at interest constitutes an incomparably greater proportion of the total annual accumulation than the annual emigration does with respect to the annual population growth. Editor's note: the term peculium in Roman law signifies the small share of property a father allowed his son or a master allowed a slave to hold as their own. Here is the editor's notes for Chapter 22, How Surplus Value is Transformed into Capital. Roman numeral lowercase 1. Conditio sine qua non is a Latin phrase that passed from legal jargon into general parlance in European languages. It means a condition without which something couldn't exist, so a necessary condition. Marx's reference to Hegel here is to the section of the philosophy of right that deals with the divisions in what Hegel calls systems of needs, that is, what Marx calls the economy, into different estates, closer to a feudal social division than Marx's classes. In the subsection from which this quote amended by Marx comes, Hegel deals with the quote-unquote substantial estate, that is, with the agricultural economy, when he says, quote, will always retain the patriarchal way of life, unquote. Editor's note, lowercase Roman numeral 2. At the National Assembly in Frankfurt on August 31st, 1848, the Silesian aristocrat Felix von Lichnowsky spoke out against Poland's historical right to independence, and in doing so repeatedly used the awkward phrase keine Datum nicht hat. Marx jumped on this, mocking Lichnowsky's double negative formulation in a newspaper piece. Number 3, Roman numeral, editor's note, a line from Goethe's Faust, Part 1, in the scene before the wager with Satan, where Faust confides to his assistant Wagner his misgivings about life without pure knowledge. Two souls, alas, reside within my breast, and each is eager for a separation. In throes of coarse desire, one grips the earth with all its senses. The other struggles from the dust to rise to high ancestral spheres. If there are spirits in the air who hold domain within this world, and heaven out of your golden haze descend, transport me to a new and brighter life. Is Goethe, Faust 1 and 2. Editor's note, Roman numeral 4. Das ist Moses und die Propheten is a phrase that means something like, that's the whole religion. Accumulation is sect, founder, Messiah, leading all to the promised land and predictor of a rich future. Roman numeral 5, lowercase. Marx is referring to the 1831 of the silk weavers in Lyon. Lowercase 6, Roman numeral. Vishnu, one of the highest Hindu gods, some of whose worshippers engage in extreme forms of self-denial and self-flagellation. Roman numeral 7, Caballero de la Triste Figura, Knight of the Sorrowful Countenance is Sancho Panza's name for Don Quixote because the vassal says of his fatigue after many battles and his missing teeth. Lowercase Roman numeral 8. The passage from Thompson's book adduced here is more paraphrase than a direct quotation. Lowercase Roman numeral 9. Dogberry. Marx uses the English word is a fruit unfit for human consumption, as well as a character in Shakespeare in Much Ado About Nothing, who thinks too highly of himself and speaks in malapropisms. It became a slangy term for incompetent official. Okay, that gets us to the end of chapter 22. I've added to this the equivalent from Ed George's notes from the prior English translation, Capital Volume 1, Chapter 24, and the notes to it, and you can look at that for yourselves in its completeness from the PDF, the online. That's included here. And I included the outline of this whole chapter from Harry Cleaver's study guide to Marx's Capital from the earlier English translation. That's why it's chapter 20. It says chapter 24 here. I have gotten to the end. Let me see if there are any notes. Happy Belgian miners. Let's see. The capitalists can therefore live more extravagantly. Hooray! Hurl the waste. Feature, not a bug. The worst of human nature, mental illness, passion for accumulation. Indeed, an addiction. And this is where Marx frustrates me. All this from the perspective of the accumulator or capitalist needs to be from the laborer's perspective. Well, to respond to that, yes, of course it does. But he is trying to describe the whole of capital. So therefore, uh, he is projecting, I suppose. That one would be one way of looking at it. Um, he does not fully explicate, and this is what some historians of labor and theorists of labor theory of value, sort of confound the problem in terms of what is the point of view of the worker, and there is some asymmetry in it in the sense that you can look at history as in the opposition between, for example, annuls history and the dominant form of history, and it is clearly asymmetric. That is the difference between, as it were, a kind of base and superstructure. That is, historiography is rarely, if ever, written by the base, etc. Let's see. Who are these political economists sowing on clarity? Ha. Smith and Ricardo assume wrongly that laborers consume the surplus. Yes, that is exactly the point. It is laborers, if laborers consume, they do not consume any, or at least a fragment of surplus labor. It is the sustenance component that they consume. Alrighty. So I have yammered on for nearly 2 hours, and let me stop the share and remove us from the live stream. This is the autonomouscollective.net. That was Karl Marx, chapter 22 of Capital Volume 1, the 2024 edition. Thank you. And later this afternoon will be Star Trek The Next Generation with Prof. John, among other things. Tonight there should be some music. I don't know if Lane is here. Lane, if you're listening, do you want to preview what's happening after Star Trek?
I want to, but I haven't a clue what I'm playing, so I can't.
Oh, okay. All right. So to be determined. I will now
Yes,
stop.
yes.